coming to you from New York. First up, we all know that actions have consequences, but U.S. financial regulators, they don't really seem to care, not that much. So huge U.S. fines on foreign banks are having some unintended consequences. What will they do? Where will they go? We look into it coming up. Then Dr. Barry Eichengreen is on the show today. Dr. Eichengreen has done considerable research on the history and operation of the international monetary and financial system. And he sat down with moi earlier today to discuss the validity of a country coupling regulatory policy and foreign policy. Dubious. And in today's Big Deal, Edward Harrison and I are discussing the annual BRICS Summit being held in Brazil right now. Sorry, no more soccer for you. But we're finding out what this means for the emerging markets, what the BRICS Summit means. It all starts right now. Hello. Now, our lead story today, actions and consequences. Massive fines placed on foreign banks by the United States are garnering a lot of pushback from the international banking community. Now, this comes following the $9 billion fine that French bank BNP Paribas has agreed to pay the U.S. government after conducting billions of dollars worth of business with Sudan, Iran, and Cuba, all of which are not on America's good list. No, they are not. But the curious thing about this situation is that France is supposed to be on America's good list, aren't they? Yeah, pretty important ally. In fact, there's another U.S. ally currently being slapped with fines by banking regulators as well, German Commerzbank. The German bank has been accused of conducting business with an Iranian state-sponsored shipping firm and could be forced to cough up between $600 and $800 million in order to resolve investigations into its compliance with U.S. sanctions. Now, over the past 5 years, over half a dozen foreign banks have settled with U.S. authorities over sanctions violations to the tune of more than $12 billion. Again, these are not U.S. banks, they're foreign banks. Back in 2012, British lender Standard Chartered was accused of hiding $250 billion worth of Iranian transactions from regulators and ultimately forked over $600 million to U.S. authorities. Now, here's the question. What effect will all of these sanctions ultimately have? That's the million-dollar question, or the trillion-dollar question, potentially. Monday, Reuters published the following on this subject, which I think sums it up pretty nicely. Financiers may grumble that the United States is acting like an imperial power in punishing foreign banks for dealing far beyond U.S. territory. But in the end, they are more likely to bow to Washington and kick against the dollar muscle. In fact, instead of turning away from the U.S., major lenders in Europe and Asia are reacting by doing more than ever to fully comply with U.S. laws, going so far as to cut ties completely with any business that puts them on Washington's bad list. Remember, you got to be on that good list if you want to stay using the dollar. Basically, foreign banks would rather miss out on potential transactions than, God forbid, be excluded from doing business in the U.S. dollar. Essentially, they could no longer do business. That's what would happen if they were excluded from it. And while countries may be looking at other ways to prevent their own banks and markets from being damaged by the scale of U.S. penalties, for now, each bank on its own has little choice but to toe Washington's line. But as I stated in the very beginning, actions do have consequences. Mark Austin of a Hong Kong-based bank trade group said, quote, regulators in some Asian jurisdictions are beginning to recognize that they need to band together as they won't get very far on their own. We are seeing a change. For now, the U.S. is content to solely serve its own geopolitical interests. But the things we do in the present could and likely will have policy implications in the future that were completely, and I mean completely unintended and truly detrimental. But only time will tell. Government slammed BNP Paribas with a major fine, and now they're going after German Commerzbank for also violating U.S. sanctions. But are these banks obligated to follow U.S. sanctions, or are they basically being bullied into playing by U.S. rules? I wanted to check with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, or who we fondly call PCR. Now, Dr. Roberts is a co-founder of Reaganomics and has also been an editor and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and Scripps Howard News Service. I first asked him what he made of the whole BNP situation. Here's what he had to say.
Well, whose law did they break?
U.S. law.
Not a French law.
No.
No. You see, look, I'm not an expert on this, but what my feeling is that the United States applies its law to all countries and says everybody, regardless if they're a sovereign state, has to obey our law. And because we announced that there were sanctions on Iran, if you, a bank in an independent country, finance business with Iran, we are going to penalize you, and if you don't pay, we're not going to let you conduct operations in the United States. So I'm not sure that the bank has broken any law because, in my opinion, the United States government does not have the option of dictating law to sovereign countries. But it's been doing it for a long, long time. It did it to Switzerland. Now they're starting on the Commerce Bank in Germany. They're trying to do the same thing to it that they just did to the French bank. I think that part of this is that Washington uses American clout over other people by threatening them to be excluded from the American market in order to hurt those financial institutions, in order to advance the financial imperialism of the American banks. So when they beat up on Barclays, they beat up on the French bank, they beat up on the German bank, then Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America, they can sort of move in easier on those, on the territory of those banks. So I think that's also part of it. In fact, it could be the main part of it. But I don't think the world should accept the fact that the United States government can decide what countries, their banks, these other sovereign countries, what the banks of sovereign countries, who they can do business with.
You've said that you see the dollar's importance diminishing over time. Is that right?
Yes, I think it has to diminish over time, and primarily because of this sanction thing. Because, you see, if you're a country and you're not part of the dollar payment system, no sanctions can be applied to you. And there's real no benefit any longer of being in the dollar payment system. It grew up at the end of World War II because the United States was the only country that had an economy. All the rest were destroyed. And so how were you going to settle international payments? You looked to the strong currency of the country that actually dominated manufacturing, trade, and so that became the world money. But today, countries have recovered. There are many countries whose currencies are just as valuable, and there's no reason not to settle trade in their own currencies. It's actually very costly. For example, Japan and China to settle their trade in dollars, because if the Chinese buy something from Japan, then they have to they have to pay a fee to convert their currency into dollars. Then they give the dollars to Japan, and then Japan has to pay a fee to convert the dollars into yen. So what is the point of these countries doing that? There's no reason any longer. And as the United States increasingly, I mean to say Washington, in order to print money to pay its bills, and in order to impose sanctions on the activities of countries that it disapproves of, I think more and more people will leave the dollar payment system.
Now, if the dollar does diminish in importance, what gains? You just mentioned some examples, but is it gold or, the Chinese currency, the euro? The reason I ask is because there doesn't seem to be a lot of options out there.
Well, you don't need a world currency anymore. As I said, the situation today is totally different from 1945. The world was destroyed. Nobody had an economy except the United States. Every other economy was destroyed or had never gotten past third world status. That's not the situation today. There are many economies. And so they can settle their trade with their own currency. There's absolutely no reason to prefer the dollar over the euro or over the Chinese currency or over the Russian ruble. There's no reason for this.
Now, some Asian countries, they've appealed to the U.S. to help them against Chinese maneuvering. So do you think China is a strategic threat to its Asian neighbors, which the U.S. should help defend against?
No, of course it's not. And look, there are some very small little islands here and there, and people are wanting to argue with it. Well, that's between them and China. It's got nothing to do with us. There's no reason for us to be involved in that. And it's certainly no reason for Washington to make an enemy out of China, because China is far stronger than these other little countries. And it's our biggest creditor. And we have huge trade relationships with it. So it's just a silly thing that Washington is doing, trying to hold on to its hegemony over the world. It really should stop it. China's not threatening anybody. It's the United States that's building bases from the Philippines to Vietnam, naval and air bases to surround China. It's the United States that's taken NATO to Russia's borders, that's calling now for troop buildups in Eastern Europe, that's putting missile bases on Russia's borders, it's trying to put Georgia and Ukraine in NATO. The aggression is not coming from China and Russia.
What are the economic implications of allowing China free rein in Asia?
Well, what do you mean allowing? It's not up to the United States who does business with China or who China does business with. The whole notion that we could disallow doesn't make any sense.
That's it.
So I think that people will do business with China because it's profitable, it pays, they have good deals. And they approach people in that way. They say, hey, look, let's do business. We come in and say, let's have military bases. Let us buy your government. Let us give payoffs. And so that you will do what we want, and we'll put military bases. It's a totally different approach.
That was Dr. Craig Roberts. Time now for a very quick break, but stick around because when we return, Dr. Barry Eichengreen is on the show. He's a well-known professor of macroeconomics and political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and he sat down with me earlier today to discuss the practice of mixing regulatory and foreign policy. It's like oil and water. And in today's big deal, Edward Harris and I are discussing the annual BRIC Summit being held in Brazil right now. And don't forget, you can see all segments featured in today's show on YouTube, youtube.com/BoomBustRT, and on Hulu, hulu.com-boom/bust. Now, before we go to break, here are a look at some of your closing numbers at the bell. Come on back with us.
We welcome Aaron Aid and Abby Martin, two of the terrific hosts on the RT network.
Boom Bust, it's going to give you a different perspective.
Give me one stock tip.
Oh, never. I'll give you the information, you make the decision.
Tell me about how breaking the set works.
It's a revolution of the mind, it's a revolution of ideas and consciousness.
Are you frustrated with the system?
Yeah, extremely.
Your politics would be described as angry.
I think I'm a strong female.
Are you single?
Welcome back. Now, with all the fines that U.S. banks have been slapping on foreign banks recently, they sure haven't made themselves any friends. However, it has demonstrated that the U.S. won't allow its currency to be used in ways that contradict its foreign policy aims. That's for sure. Yeah, no friends, but they got that point across. But as the world's reserve currency, such actions might prove disruptive for countries that disobey U.S. foreign policy rules. So I wanted to check in with Dr. Barry Eichengreen. Now, Eichengreen is a well-known professor of macroeconomics and political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and he has done considerable research on the history and operation of the international monetary and financial systems. And we wanted to get his take on the whole situation right now. So I first asked him if he thinks it's valid for the U.S. to couple regulatory policy and foreign policy in this way. Here's what he had to say.
I don't know if it's a matter of being valid or invalid. It's what governments do. The United States did it in 1956 when it used the dollar and U.S. financial power to force the French and British governments to roll back their invasion of Suez. Financial power is used repeatedly, and when you have a case like a European bank funneling money to the government of Sudan, I think it's entirely appropriate for the U.S. government to use whatever instruments it has at its disposal to discourage that.
Yeah, you know what, Barry, I have to say that I kind of agree with you. When I first heard this story, I was outraged. But then, you know, the more I read about it and the more that I learn about all these sanctions we've had a lot in the past 5 years on foreign banks, it seems like it's almost shocking that anyone is shocked on some level. Do you not agree?
Well, I think what is shocking is that the French authorities either were unaware of what BNP Paribas was doing, or they looked the other way. Either way, it doesn't reflect well on the quality of European supervision and regulation of the financial system. We know that banks are in the business of making money and moving money, and it's the role of the regulator, the role of the supervisor to be sure that they do so in socially constructive ways. So the financial crisis was one reminder that banks can be weapons of mass financial destruction, and I think this affair is another reminder.
Now, Barry, the U.S. is perhaps the only country in the world to have imposed sanctions and then fined a major bank from an allied country for violating those sanctions. Now, because the U.S. dollar is the world's major reserve currency, what impact will these kinds of fines have on the U.S. reserve currency status, if any at all?
I think very limited impact. The reason that the United States is the only country to use these kind of financial sanctions is that the dollar has the exorbitant privilege of being the world's currency. The vast majority of foreign exchange transactions and finance for imports, which is what the government of Sudan wanted, go through the dollar and go through New York financial markets. So that's why the U.S. could do it. What impact will it have? I think some governments that are unhappy about the fact, like France, and other governments that are worried about the fact, like Iran, North Korea, will look for alternatives to the dollar. I think there are very few alternatives in the short run. European markets are not as deep and liquid as markets in the dollar. Chinese financial markets are far from as deep and liquid as markets in the dollar. So it would take mass migration of importers, exporters, foreign investors, both private and public, away from the dollar toward another currency in order to change that situation. And that simply is not going to happen in the short run.
But could it potentially happen in the long run?
Shameless plug for my book, Exorbitant Privilege. I think it will happen in the long run, that the United States is no longer large enough relative to the world economy to be the only supplier of safe and liquid assets to the world as a whole. So there will have to be other suppliers. And I think the Eurozone and China, as the two other big economies on the world scene, are the plausible suppliers. But both Europe and China will have to get their acts together financially for that to happen. So will it happen this year? No. Will it happen next year? No. But 10 or 20 years from now, I think there will be two full-fledged rivals to the dollar.
Now, I'm glad that you bring up China, because the Chinese renminbi is increasingly mentioned as a potential reserve currency, but a lot of things have to change to make that happen, like you just mentioned. Now, recently, China Construction Bank was made the official renminbi clearing bank for London and Bank of China for Frankfurt. So what importance do these moves have?
Well, the fact that there are official clearing banks, Chinese clearing banks in London and Frankfurt, will reduce the cost slightly of Europeans exchanging their pound sterling and euros for Chinese renminbi. They don't have to go through the dollar in order to buy renminbi. There are now a couple of big Chinese banks that can source renminbi onshore in Shanghai and sell it to European banks and firms who need it for their international transactions. So that will promote the use of the renminbi in Europe. I don't think it's going to change the financial landscape in the short run, but it's a positive step from the point of view of renminbi internationalization.
Now, Craig Roberts told me that the future of the international monetary system has to match our multipolar global economy, in which the U.S. is just one actor. Do you agree? And if so, why?
Well, it's like George Orwell in Animal Farm, right? All the animals are created equal. Some are more equal than others. I think we will move toward a more multipolar monetary system that better matches our multipolar global economy because, as I said before, the United States will not be big enough to provide safe and liquid assets on the scale that the 21st century global economy requires. But the dollar is likely to be first among equals for a considerable period going forward, simply because the U.S. Treasury bond market is the single largest financial market in the world. It's deep, it's liquid, it's a safe haven, it's the market that investors instinctually move toward whenever a bad financial thing happens, because the Fed is there to provide dollar liquidity when it's required. The willingness of the European Central Bank to provide euro liquidity is an open question in some sense, and the ability of the People's Bank of China, what with Chinese capital controls, renders its ability to do so an open question as well.
That was Dr. Barry Eichengreen, professor of economics at UC Berkeley. Time now for today's Big Deal. Remote Big Deal time with Edward Harrison. It's good to see you remotely, Ed. I missed you today.
Yes.
Now, audience out there, in today's Big Deal, Edward Harrison and I are discussing the annual BRICS Summit and what the summit might mean for emerging markets. So before we begin, the BRICS nations are, can you guess it? Drum roll. I know you know. Brazil, Russia, India, China. Can you guess the last one, Ed? Do you have this one?
South Africa.
Yeah, okay, so those are the BRICS. And they're grouped together due to their size and the strength of their economies. And this summit is a multilateral forum for these economies. And coincidentally enough, it's being held just days after the World Cup wraps. So, Edward, we've been talking about currencies a lot on the show today. And now, is there anything on the agenda at this summit that might have an effect on our international monetary system, or any fundamental consequences on what we use as reserve currency? Truly fundamental, because I think the answer is no, but I'll throw it over to you.
Well, no, actually, I think there is something that's interesting. Not that they'll necessarily agree on it, but they're talking about an alternative to the IMF, a $100 billion IMF fund, and then some other $50 billion fund to go along with that in terms of liquidity. But basically what it boils down to is that the IMF, as it's been developed, is really about Western Europe and now, the whole of Europe in terms of the EU and North America and their hegemony over policy issues in terms of the global financial system. And so as the emerging markets have become much more important from an economic perspective. They're looking for a greater voice. And they feel that they've been blocked in the IMF, in the World Bank, and all these other multilateral lending institutions from having this greater voice. And therefore, the BRICS, as the most important emerging market countries, are going out and saying, yeah, we're going to actually do it on our own. We're going to make our own multilateral institution and do an end run around these other institutions.
Now, as you mentioned, there are a bunch, and I mean a bunch of multilateral forums on economics. We have the OECD, G7, G20, BRICS now. But are these primarily diplomatic and political organizations, or do they have any serious economic implications? Basically, what I mean is, what really joins these economies together?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, because ultimately the fact that you even asked the question suggests that they're really just talking sessions, that there's nothing that really gets solved in those sessions. But I think to a certain degree, it's important for them to coalesce on certain ideas and come together in order to, over time, start to formulate policy. So when we had Barry Eichengreen talking about what's going to happen in terms of the multipolar world, that's what we're talking about with regard to the BRICS. If you think about the European Union, the fact that the euro even exists is really a result of their understanding that they could not compete against the United States in terms of having economic power unless they came together as one currency. And even now, the Europeans, they don't have the depth of the U.S. markets. They don't have the treasury market because they're all balkanized. You have the German Bund market, you have the French market, you have the Spanish market. So eventually they're going to want to come together and have one market that has enough liquidity to be able to rival the United States.
Now, Ed, can you explain to me the purpose of a BRICS bank? Would it be like any other sort of, developmental bank, such as the World Bank or the Inter-American Developmental Bank, Asian Developmental Bank? What would it be like?
Well, yeah, it would essentially be their alternative, where it's like the Europeans, when they talked about the European Monetary Fund. We control the levers of power. We, the BRICS, we control all of the political operational machinery of this particular organization. And as a result of that, we get to decide how things get implemented. So when bad things happen, then the liquidity that gets provided is politically in our hands rather than in the hands of the United States and its allies.
Now, many of the BRICS nations have been in the news lately. Russia and the West have been experiencing a lot of tension over Ukraine. China has been flexing its muscle in Asia. But each country has very different political traditions and economies. So really quickly, how do you think these countries' differences affect their ability to find common ground?
They very much do, and so I think that we'll find in this particular summit that we're not going to necessarily get to any concrete conclusions, but at a minimum, we're going to move in that direction.
Ed, thank you so much. I'll be back with you in the flesh tomorrow, but that's all for now. Thank you, thank you. We love hearing from you, so you out there in TV land, please check out our Facebook page and drop us a line, facebook.com/BoomBustRT, and please tweet at us @AaronAid, @EdwardNH. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.